I think that's everybody. And good evening, everybody, to ASSAP's webinar this cold and frosty day in Somerset. Thank you all so much for coming this evening for Karin Beasant.
As a Bristolian, you think you know your city's history, and unfortunately, there is so much out there that unless you dig, you can find some absolute gems. And I was very, very lucky to be friends with, let's start this. It's not doing it. Okay. Oh dear. Let's go back out. Let's try it this way. There we go. I was very lucky to be friends with Matt and Chris, who own Q Studios in Bristol. And we were there one day having a cup of tea and a natter, as you do. And Chris said, why don't we do a little fun project? And I thought, yeah, brilliant idea. I thought it'd just be a little something for YouTube, a bit of fun. What I didn't realize was how this would turn out and the story yet to come. So we looked around some history for Bristol. Then we came across John Horwood and his hanging for the 13th of April, 1821. And this was my first step into research, production, and wow, what an amazing journey. Unfortunately, COVID stopped everything, so it's been on halt. So I thought, what shall I do without giving anything away for what's coming next? So I thought I would give the case of John Horwood, and then you decide whether you think he's guilty or innocent. Now, with this wonderful man, I'll just bring that up a little bit. I have a very biased view, but I'm going to try and make this as unbiased as possible. So this is the lad as he was drawn on his trial. He was 17 when he was charged, and he just turned 18 2 days before he was executed in Bristol. I don't know if any of you have had the luck to go to the Shed Museum in Bristol, where you will see a book, and many of you may not realise it's made with the skin of John Horwood, taken from his back. It was sent to a tannery in Bristol and made into leather, then etched, and a Dr. Smith added his notes about John inside. This book is absolutely huge. And if you look on the internet, you will see one thing that really bugs me. It says the Bristol Record Office owns the book. They don't. It is owned by the late Mary Halliwell, who I'll talk about later, and she decided to gift it to Bristol because to show the horrors of previous time, and it should be saved for prosperity for future generations. And that is Thomas Ware Tannery, where I went to do some research and where we later interviewed. They started in 1840. Bristol was awash with tanneries. Even the sewage pipes used to end up with big clobs of fat that had to have workmen going in and digging it all out. That was the lovely centre of Bristol with loads of pollution and fumes. No wonder the sons of our family that I'm attached to are all mad. Oh, page down. And this is the lovely Mary Halliwell. She was from the northern part of England, and I've never met a more direct woman who called a spade and took on the University of Bristol and fought to have her descendant buried with dignity, and she did. Unfortunately, she passed away during COVID, but I will talk about a promise I made to her at the end of the talk. I have a quote from Mary of the first time that she handled and touched the Book of Skin. This is her words. The first thing I noticed was the awful smell. I could only describe it as rotten leather. With age, it had turned dark brown, and I could see the skull and crossbones embossed in each corner, and the inscription, Curtis Werner Johannes Horwood, which translate as the skin of John Horwood. So let us go to the beginning. The hamlet of Hannam is in the parish of Bitton, and it's 4.5 miles from Bristol. Now, in 1821, round about that time, Bristol was quite a lot smaller, as we know. Now, from my house in South Bristol, without the traffic, I could get to Hannam in about 25 minutes. Unfortunately, with traffic, it can be an hour, even though it's just down the road from me. So the area that we're talking about once formed the King's Wood forest. So the medieval kings had massive swathes of land where they were hunt, and locals were not allowed to hunt or do anything inside it on pain of death. Now, these folks in the King's Wood were a hardy lot indeed. The famous John Wesley, who arrived in the 1700s, actually converted a lot of them to his Methodism, and he built schools, and he had a vast effect on the people, including later on my great-great-grandparents who became Methodists. There was also in the Kingswood, as in any local area, the notorious Cock Road Gang. Now, they were a huge family that controlled everything. So if you wanted to walk through, you had to pay them a toll. They were so notorious by the early 1820s, the vast majority of them were either hung at Gloucester prison, transported to Australia, or put into prison. That's how notorious they were. But that's a talk all on its own. So with Hannam, you have quarries, coal pits, zinc smelting, and you had at that time period children as well as women working down in the mines, and injuries were common. The Mines Act of 1842 came into effect that children under the age of 10 and women were finally stopped from working underground. But from an early late age of John's time, especially the poor families that, that lived around that area, you had to work, simple as. So John's parents were Thomas Horwood and Phoebe Palatine, who met in London, fell in love, and were married in 1786 and moved to Hannam to live. They had 10 children, as a lot of families did in that time period. Obviously, no television around. Most of whom survived into adulthood. 2 boys had accidents in the Pile Marsh pit in 1806. So Pile Marsh, if anyone knows Bristol, is just over the feeder. You wouldn't even know it's there now. It's just a green acre. But funny enough, Amelia Dyer, the famous woman who murdered all the babies, was born just around the corner from there. So in 1806, Joseph broke his leg, and then James died in an accident there. They were pulling up by a rope, 3 of them. The rope snapped and they all fell to their death. Now, this seemed to have an impact on young John Horwood. He had started work as a young boy in the coal pits and, due to the many accidents, refused to carry on working there. So he was 17. He worked a little bit, didn't work, and nowadays you just call him a typical teenager. Eliza Balsam. Unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of Eliza that have survived. We know that she was the same age as him, and they grew up together, and John had quite a crush on her. John seemed to fancy Eliza more than she fancied him. So what was John really like? We know that his mother doted on him. Others said he was completely misunderstood lad. He was in and out of work. He would get money from his mother to buy new clothes, saying it was to look for work. So I would say, like my 27-year-old who's moved back home, that they know how to sweet talk their mothers. So John spent time doing nothing, just hanging around with Eliza and her friends. So we know he was trying to court her. He was also involved in stealing of apples and minor thefts. He obviously got up to mischief, but did that make him a bad character? As I say, the decision's yours at the end. Now, with the courting with Eliza, John was getting frustrated. She was not taking seriously his demands for the courting. This was said by their friends. We know of 2 occasions that he assaulted her. In those days, that terminology could mean spoken roughly, put hands on her, or held her in a rough way. But she asked some nearby men to help her on 1 occasion. We also know that John threw vitriol oil, or sulfuric acid as we call it, causing burns and an eye damage. Was this in frustration, or was it the act of a horrible teen? So with that and some other small occasions of John being naughty, the scene was set what followed on the night of the 22nd of January 1821. Eliza was asked by her mother to deliver fruit to Bristol. Now, that's 7 miles, so it would have taken her quite a few, 2-3 hours to walk there. And I was trying to find something to show how busy and bustling Bristol was at that time period. It was a long walk there and back, and she didn't return to darkness. She was with her friends Joseph Rees and William Waddy, who was claimed that she was his new boo. John spotted Eliza crossing a stream in Hannam with her company. John was on a higher bank about 40 yards away. Now remember, this was late, probably about 8 p.m. at night. So the only thing that lit the sky would be a partial moon. We don't know if it was a full moonlight, cloudy or not, but obviously remember it was January. It is said John picked up a stone and threw it as hard as he could at Eliza. It struck her on the right temple of her head, and she stumbled back into the stream. It has been claimed that one of John's friends said, "There you go, you've had it at last." The lads ran away and Eliza was carried home. We know that Eliza suffered from headaches over the next few days, and her widowed mother put on a bread poultice to help her. But after several days, Eliza decided to walk all the way to the Bristol Infirmary, which was near the city centre at the time. So I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of Dr. Richard Smith, who saw her and who is pivotal in the John Horwood experience. So Dr. Richard Smith was born in a well-to-do family in Bristol in 1772. His father was a surgeon, and Richard was expected to become one himself, which he did. While studying, Richard was also a grave robber. So the Murder Act of 1752, what was happening, they noticed that the death penalty wasn't having such a good effect to, reduce crime. And with most people being religious, they realized that if they said, right, anyone that was convicted of murder only would not be given a Christian burial, their body would be given over to the surgeons to dissect publicly, and the remains would be either buried somewhere but not in Christian ground. So obviously that started the rise of the grave robbers and would-be surgeons. It was very common for there to do that. I have two accounts of Dr. Smith, one in a Bedminster graveyard about 3 miles from where I live, digging up a body, and he was caught. He just had a slapped wrist by the judge. Another of him and a student who dropped a head and it rolled down the high street, because the high street in the centre of Bristol is on a hill. And they ran after it in darkness and they retrieved the head. I don't know where they got it from. He was a collector of bodies. His father had a big display of the macabre and the wonderful. And Richard was also fascinated, and his collection was absolutely huge. He would take death masks of executed prisoners, and as the grave trade was in its height, we know that at the Bristol Infirmary, Richard had a key to the dead room. Now, the dead room was where they stored the bodies in coffins before the undertakers would come and take them away. We do know that some of the coffins, most likely the working class only, were filled with sand. So there is a good example when they were building in Birmingham, the H2O railway link. They were, archaeologists were digging through a graveyard and found coffins filled with sand. So it happens around the country. Richard also had a huge collection of skeletons, parts of bodies at his own private museum. When he died in 1843, it went to the Bristol University, and then some of his collection was sold and is now scattered around the world today, including the skull cap of Eliza Balsam, showcasing the trepanning. When Dr. Smith died, he was so respected in Bristol, thousands lined the streets from his home to his resting place in Temple Church. That is Dr. Smith. So, this is the Bristol Infirmary. It was quite a grand place. Now, the working class didn't want to stay because obviously it would cost them. There was no free healthcare. So Eliza attends Bristol Infirmary, and Dr. Smith happened to be there when she came in. He insisted she remain at the hospital, though she was reluctant, and asked her how she came by the wound when it became infected. Eliza told Dr. Smith what had happened, and he then reported the incident to the local magistrates. 2 magistrates came to the hospital and interviewed Eliza. She said Horwood had thrown a stone with the intention of killing her. So the scene was set now. The magistrates then issued a warrant for John Horwood's arrest. 2 sheriffs called Bull and So, what name, were instructed to attend his home and arrest him. When they approached the cottage, his sister, who lived on the cottage next to his family, decided to waylay them. John heard the commotion and tried to escape through a window. This failed. He then picked up a quarryman's hammer and stood his ground at the top of the stairs. He tried to attack both men, but finally Bull struck him and handcuffed him and took him away. What is interesting is that the carriage stopped outside the Bristol Infirmary and Horwood was taken to see Dr. Smith. Now, Dr. Smith took him into his room where he had the two skeletons of the baby murderers, Maria Davis and Charlotte Bobbitt, who had been hanged in 1802 at the top of St. Michael's Hill for murder. Now, in Bristol, hangings took place on the border between Bristol and Gloucestershire. And this roundabout, the top of St. Michael's Hill, there is a commemorative plate, but that's where the hangings took place until they built the Bristol Gaol jail. And then hangings commenced there. And John Horwood happened to be the first one in 1821. Just on a side note, the skeletons of those two ladies were in the university cupboard with John for many years. When John Horwood's remains were removed, I found out, because I wanted to find out about them, I rang the university and they quietly had them incinerated, which is a shame because it's a part of history that's lost. But obviously human remains now can be quite controversial. So whether Dr. Smith was trying to scare Horwood or just show how serious he was about Eliza's condition is not really clear what his intentions exactly were. But shortly after Horwood was taken to Eliza's bedside with the magistrates, Dr. Smith said to Eliza, "Here is Horwood close by. Would you be afraid to see him?" Eliza replied, "Yes, he will kill me." Dr. Smith said he will protect her. Smith asked if she knew Horwood and she replied, "Yes, that is the villain that murdered me." Horwood only managed to get the word out, "I." And Eliza then said, "He threw a stone at me." Horwood said no more. The magistrate then persisted and asked Horwood if he had anything to say. His words, "I did not do it. I know who did, but it wasn't me." Horwood was then taken into custody in the nearby Bridewell prison. By the 10th of February, though, the wound on Eliza's temple was inflamed and she became feverish. Dr. Smith consulted with his fellow doctors and it was agreed that trepanning would be needed. Now, I don't know why. I've got the pictures of Eliza's skulls and the trepanning instrument, but I forgot to put them on the PowerPoint, so apologies. So those who don't know trepanning, that's been being done without any pain relief for thousands of years. I think even the ancient Egyptians did it. And it's where they would drill a hole into the skull to release the pressure. But bearing in the time there was no cleanliness in the hospitals, unfortunately, it didn't take long before an infection would take place. So Dr. Smith said that when he proceeded with the trepanning, he found a small quantity of matter between the dura mater and the bone. At first, Eliza became a little better, then a relapse, and she died unfortunately 7 days later. Was the stone to blame or the trepanning? You're the jury to decide. An inquest was held at the nearby full moon. Now that's how it looks now. It's quite a colourful looking pub, but most pubs in Bristol were either inquests or courts, unless it was deemed that important that it would go to the Crown Court. So the inquest was held at the full moon nearby. It only took 3 hours for the jury to say it was willful murder. Remember that Dr. Smith did the autopsy on Eliza, and his medical opinion and a witness, so he was heavily involved in the consequences. John Horwood was now charged with murder and sent to the Bristol Gaol for trial at the next assizes. Eliza's body was given to her mother and her funeral took place on the 25th of February, and she was interred in St Mary's Churchyard in Bitton. Now, I can't find her resting place. I've tried. So she may have an unmarked grave, but not sure if we can find it on the burial records. Who knows? Now we get to John Horwood's family. So remember, they're simple working class, money is tight, but the whole family gave what little money they had to their father, and he appointed solicitor Smith in Broderick to defend his son. So this is an old engraving of the Bristol Gaol. You can see the entrance gates, and it was quite a state-of-the-art prison. It was commissioned in 1860 and cost over £60,000 to be built. It opened in 1820. And then John, unfortunately, would be the first person to be hanged there, as I said earlier. Bristol had two other well-known prisons, Newgate and the older Bridewell, which was a medieval prison. They were in an awful state, so a new prison was much needed in the growing city of Bristol. The new prison could hold 197 prisoners of both sexes, so no cat was needed to stop the rats going at the toes of the prisoner, as was the custom in the old prison. And women, children, and men had been housed together. So, unfortunately, a lot of pregnancies took place in prison as well. So in the new gaol, there were single cells, which each measuring 6 feet by 9. Male and female prisoners were kept separate, and prisoners were even allowed a bath once a week, which I find brilliant when you think how often people did bath in those days. So we get to the trial, and that's done in another pub in Bedminster, about a mile and a half from the Full Moon. It's a different name now, but this was quite a notorious pub in Bedminster. Bedminster had a lot of coal mines. It was very working class. And at one point out the back, a lion was kept for entertainment and mauled a assistant trainer. But that's another story for another time. There's always a story in a story. So Wednesday, the 11th of April, 1821, the judge arrived at Bristol and had quite a few trials, so time was against Horwood when it came to his turn. He just wanted to get them all done and dusted quickly. Now, the trial itself, I could talk about 3 hours just on that, so I'm going to give a brief overview because the John Horwood story is a massive story, and later on, we hope to do it justice. So, what was quickly apparent that John Horwood didn't have a very good defence. The jury was soon convinced by Dr. Smith, who, when he gave witness, many didn't realise he actually had the skull of Eliza in his coat pocket. John Horwood was unable to read or write, not unusual in that time frame, but he may have had what we now call learning to difficulties, as he seemed to now realise how serious his situation was starting to be. One quote from the trial was this: Horwood had said to Eliza when she played with his ears, "If thee don't let alone my ears, I'll kill thee," which is an interesting, my son's autistic. Who knows? That could be something to do with the way he reacted. Also, his father was an absolute advocate and believed in John's innocence. In the throw-in of the acid incident, Father Horwood made inquiries and it was discovered that the dress actually belonged to Eliza's sister and there was only a small hole. So was Eliza being fancy about some of her claims, what John was like with her? I have to say that I was hit on the temple with a stone when I was about 13, and I only had a bruise and a sore hand because I hit the lad who did that to me, so he went down as well. Us women got to stand up for ourselves, I say. We also have the testimony of Mrs. Jones, the neighbour, who had both Eliza and John in her cottage and saying that they were on the best of terms. That was only a couple of weeks before the throwing of the stone incident. The stream where the stone was thrown was a local haunt for children, and stone throwing was a common activity. When John threw the stone, as it was dark, did he mean to do it or did he actually do it? You are the jury to decide. The prosecution had plenty of witnesses that swore on oath that John's bad behaviour and threats to Eliza. One witness for the prosecution was blind drunk when he actually took the stand and couldn't even remember the next day what he had said. Dates were confused when given evidence, and it didn't help that newspapers claimed that John was 28, to which the baptism record had to be obtained and proof given to the local press. When John was in prison, he was assured there was no way he would get hanged, but would expect a prison sentence by other prisoners in the jail. Also, Horwood, who was not religious at that time, was visited frequently by a Reverend Roberts. It seemed the Reverend had a calming effect on him and talked to him at great length of heaven and hell and what may expect him in the future. One of Horwood's friends also turned Queen's Justice and said they saw his arm raised if he had thrown something. When Dr. Smith was called to the witness stand, it was Smith's statement to the court that said the cause of death was the stone that caused the injury caused the inflammation caused the abscess caused the death. Unfortunately, the odds were stacked against him. John was found guilty. There was no reprieve. He was to be hanged just a few days later above the gates of the prison, and the date was set for Friday the 13th of April 1821, 2 days after his 18th birthday. Mr. Horwood, John's father, then wrote to Dr. Smith begging for his son's body after the hanging so we could give the poor man a Christian burial. This was denied. The papers, as of today, were full of the story and it attracted people far and wide to watch the hanging. Dr. Smith had no intention of giving up a nice, ripe young body to dissect and to give public displays of his expertise, as was common of men of his standing in the medical profession. The day before his execution, John Horwood was visited by his family. Tears were shed, and John had now turned to the Reverend and taken God into his heart. Now, the photo before of the prison, you would have seen the banks of the river called the New Cut. On the date of the execution, there were said to be, I can't think, about 10,000 people there. You imagine that. Adults, children, etc. Some nearly fell into the river. Warnings were put up to be careful. Now, as the hanging was a long drop, it would mean up to 15 minutes of suffocation and withering in agony. The ministers, religious ministers who visited him in the morning, told him of the sermon that would be said from it nearby Jeffreys Hill in his memory on that coming Sunday. Jeffreys Hill is literally about 15 minutes walk from Hanham. So it would have been for the local community, though thousands joined it on that Sunday morning. The prison chaplain conducted a religious service inside the prison, and John was invited to speak after. These are his words from this young lad. My fellow prisoners, I am about to die, although you told me that I would not. I am not afraid, but remember, it was sin that brought me to this. Let me warn you to take me in as example. At 18 years of age, I lose my life through sin. And if you do not break off your bad habits, the end will be bad. The effect of the address was so moving that many of the prisoners were found crying. John Horwood then thanked the governor of the prison, the guards, and went quietly in dignity to the noose. He climbed the scaffold steps. That is the gates of the prison to show you. So the scaffold had been erected just in on top of the prison there, and there was a door for him to come up. He climbed the scaffold steps in chains and leg irons, stood in front of the noose, and raised his eyes to heaven. The noose was put around his neck, adjustments made. At 1:30, John Horwood dropped his handkerchief as a sign he was ready. Then he was hung. Dr. Smith then, as soon as the body was announced deceased, whisked him away in a closed carriage to the infirmary. The following Monday, a public dissection was conducted by Dr. Smith of Horwood. The gallery was full of men and women watching this dissection, and they had to pay as well. Now, this was taken from the Book of Skin that that Dr. Smith put together after. So poor Horwood, as you can see, his head had been shaved. Next day, and remember that the body had been hung on the Friday, and it was the Tuesday. It was starting to smell quite bad. Tuesday, the body was given up to Dr. Smith's students, who then dissected what was left. And on the Wednesday, the back of his skin was removed and sent to the tanners. Though it took 7 years before the skeleton of Horwood was put together and put into a fancy case, this was a much prized item by Dr. Smith. During that time, it was also common to make gifts from the tanned leather of executed prisoners, slippers, all sorts of things, even gloves. So we get on now to 2011. And these are the photos of Alan Bryant, the local historian. And along came Mary Hallowell, who, researching the family's history, found out about John Horwood. So she contacted the University of Bristol and went to see and saw his cabinet with his skeleton, plus the 2 other girls just in a cupboard under the stairs. She asked what they were going to do, and they said, oh, well, we can just incinerate it for you. You should know he deserves better. So we contacted a local undertaker called Austin Davis, who I know now really well. And that man researched how to do a funeral from 1821 it was very interesting that only certain hymns could be sung because he was a convict, and the religious service had to be done in a certain way with a black coffin. So you will see, like I see Karin nodding, that where his father was buried, 190 years and to the minute when the noose went tight around John Horwood's neck, the coffin of John Horwood was laid in rest above the body of his late father. Now, we went to film Mary Halliwell and her husband. Her husband wrote an amazing book about it. Now, I found it quite emotional. There was this woman, didn't know this ancestor, and she said to me that I've got him buried, Karen. I'm going to get quite emotional. My time's not long. I want you to get him a pardon. And I haven't forgotten the promise I made. So, unfortunately, COVID came. It stopped filming. But what I can say, next year, myself and the wonderful Dr. Kate Cherrell, who I interviewed originally, is how I met her, are reprised in this documentary. We have new evidence which may say that he was innocent. But given the evidence that I've said today, it's up to you if you think he was guilty or not. But we are very, very excited to bring a different opinion, and also I will be doing a funding to get a memorial for Eliza because she's still an innocent party. As she has no grave marker, I know a wonderful stonemason, and he's offered it cost to do a memorial stone if the church is happy, so she is not forgotten in history as well. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't bore you.
Thank you very much, Karin. What an amazing talk, as normal. So, in your bio that you sent to me, you said that you really enjoy the history. Tell us what it is and what made you decide that the history is important.
So, in school, as I've said many times, I had a terrible education, as my near 97 German grandmother always reminds me, because I never did university. The only subject I did really well was history, because I found that an escape from every day, but also I was fascinated in how our language has changed down the centuries, how we speak. So when my mum came to Bristol in the 1954, she couldn't understand Bristolian, which was very, very prominent. But also, if ghosts are real, and I'm very skeptical now, and suddenly you're talking to a monk from the 1400s or someone from the 1700s, surely you should put the effort in to talk as they would have done. And also accents. Accents were so pronounced around the county. Now, my Bristolian, I believe, is what's left of the Wessex accent originally. And I'm really proud of it. I spent so many years trying to hide it. But now I think it's something to be proud of. And it's trendy to talk on radio and telly with an accent, even though you sound like Farmer George.
So, you say that you've got this production that's coming up soon. Can you give us a timeline when you think that it will be available?
It all depends on Dr. Kate because she is extremely busy. She doesn't stop. And we were having a conversation a few months ago, and I said to the boys, I said, I can't let the Horwood die, because we interviewed Professor Smith, who was in Nambia, who held the skull of Eliza, looked at it, and as he's a medical specialist, told us exactly what she died of. Ha ha! Not telling you. You'll have to wait and see. But also going to a tannery and learning how they tanned, how they did it in years back. It opens up such a fascinating world you didn't know is on your doorstep to learn and to interact. Kingswood Museum, just outside Bristol, still has the cabinet that John Horwood was stored in and part of the rope that hung him, because we think they were thick ropes. They were thin ropes, and then they were sold as souvenirs.
Yeah.
And these wonderful expressions like pull the other one, pulling the people down to end their suffering quickly on the
Yeah.
wagon. They used to be taken on the wagon to the place of execution. Money, fraud, rope. There's so much out there. And
It, it
with
sprung to mind when
having
you were
part,
talking. It sprung to mind
yeah,
when you were talking about the tannery, that the, excuse me for swearing, the names, things like you're piss poor, because if you were that poor, you had to take your wee to the tannery for them to use to set the colour. And if you were so poor that you couldn't actually afford something to take your wee into the tannery, you were so
didn't
poor
have
that
a
you didn't have a
pot to
pot
piss in.
pissing. Yeah.
But also the Thomas Ware Tannery in Bristol, which has been going since 1840, they are specialist tanners. So they use the bark of one particular tree, which they grow, and their leather is exported around the world for very expensive saddles and things like that. And to walk around and see these pits, as I showed earlier, where everything's dipped in and it's still done the old-fashioned way. And this wonderful man from there whose knowledge of tanning was brilliant to the documentary. All this will be shown.
Thank you. I think we've got a few questions. Christian, my lovely, would you like to ask the questions today?
Yes, we certainly have a few. Thank you very much, Karen. That was a fantastic talk, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. So, I guess the first question actually is one of my own: is that how was the practice of turning human skin into book covers perceived during that time period? Was it unusual, or was it a kind of a regular
No,
thing?
it was common. Richard Felix talks about it a lot. Um, There's even part of a face. I can't remember where it is, where it's still got the ear attached as well. And they were parts of the executed, then were tanned given in gifts, like to local magistrate and that. And this book of skin was a prize thing. It's still a prize thing in Bristol now. But it's important to keep it as a history lesson.
So, in that context, and to follow up with that, I mean, so we know obviously why John Howard's skin was chosen for that purpose in that sense, but was it more of the symbolism of punishment after death because of what he did?
Well, from my personal point of view, Dr. Smith, um, I believe he's the villain in this case. I will be honest. There's a wonderful book written about him from Mike Whitford. I did meet him. We interviewed him, and yeah, he was a man of his time. But you have to remember, working class didn't have a chance in hell with justice. Um, he also he having a key to the dead room. I don't believe Eliza's body is buried in the churchyard. I believe her body completely. He took it. He took the skull without permission. So he took the head. He got rid of all the flesh, kept her skull. And her poor widowed mother, because the bodies would decay so fast, the coffins would be sealed. No one would know.
I mean, there's a comment here rather than a question. It does seem like the professional is taking advantage of that legal system. Like you said there, the working class people generally didn't have the snowball's chance in hell of any kind of legal representative that did them justice. And then there's clearly an opportunity for professionals to take advantage of that system. I guess particularly when you've also got students who are also paying you for that privilege too. And there's
Mm.
obviously people in the gallery who are paying as well. There is clearly a financial incentive to keep that system going in that way.
Oh, Dr. Smith, there's a portrait of him still at the university, I think. He is revered in Bristol with his legacy, but he was a grave robber. And the thing is, they got away with it because of who they were or connected to. Two of the magistrates, are friends of his, owned tanneries. It's not what you know. Even nowadays, it's who you know, the connections.
For sure, sure. So the question here is from Chris, also spelled with a K. Thank you very much. Hello, how you doing? Was the practice of making items from human bodies again common practice? But was this also limited to only prisoners and convicts? Would this also be done to other people who actually were innocent who had died as well? That practice of taking the skin.
Yeah. When the 1752 Murder Act came in, even then, on average, there were about 52 bodies a year that were guilty of murder. Even though there were over 200 offences, you had to kill someone to be allowed the body to be dissected.
Wow.
So hence grave robbing was a big deal because all these aspiring medical professionals needed bodies. It's only when they brought in, I think there was an act later on about the 1840s or 1860s that then gave cadavers from the workhouse or the poorhouse. So then there wasn't a need for grave robbing anymore.
So also, could you describe the book itself? And what does it contain? Who authored it? What kind of contents are inside it?
So the book itself has transcripts that Dr. Smith, it's like all the posters, all his writing, sketches, it's all in there. It's like a history of his involvement. It's fascinating. If anyone wants a copy, I've got a copy of all the insides.
Wow, that's awesome. So, Aislinn says here, I heard about a superstition about walking under a ladder was after an attempted hanging that the guy was too tall and his toes touched the ground and saved him. And from then on, they walked the prisoner under the ladder to make sure he was taller than him. I read that years ago. Not sure how valid it is, but it makes sense now.
I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, it does make a kind of sense, doesn't it? So, from an ethical point of view, from a societal implications perspective, what do you think the public opinion at the time, how they would have viewed this act? It's clearly something they are very familiar with. Say compared to today's ethical standards. What is the public opinion of this? Were they happy with the fact that this happened to this person who, at the time, was considered to be a terrible individual who had caused a murder?
That because of the press and the trial, he was, and even online, you'll see him vilified as a horrible lad, willfully murdered this girl. Now, like with everything, there's opinions both sides for and against. We know that the stone did not kill her. And unfortunately, with the medical knowledge at that time, Dr. Smith, when you think he did the autopsies on John, on Eliza, he did the trepanning. Imagine the chance to be revered against his peers for doing a trepanning. It went wrong, but who's he going to blame? He's going to blame John. And the stone throwing. He tried to save her life. He came across as a wonderful man trying so hard to save a simple working class girl.
Well, it's true. So, what do you think has happened, say, to the medical ethics now? I mean, when did that transition away from doing that as a practice?
So I think more. I don't know of any after the 1840s because then when you had Victoria, especially on the throne, and the reforming the prisons and lots of Victorian prisons built, it seems to have died out. But I can't be for sure. That's not my line. Richard Felix would know. My God, he would talk for hours. He's amazing on the subject.
Just look at the cultural legacy. I mean, how is John remembered today in the context of criminal justice?
He's remembered as a man who killed a girl. There's no middle way. That's why hopefully next year we want to get out. If Kate, because I mean Kate's going to be in charge of this project, she's going to narrate it. We've got all the filming except for some extra bits that she wants to add. And as Professor Smith lives in Northern Ireland now, it would be nice to go and meet him face to face. This amazing South African man who's looking at this historic skull cap, and you can see all the trepanning and everything. But it's also sad because that was a young 18-year-old girl.
Yeah, absolutely. I see where you're coming from. So, are there any lesser known details about Horwood's life? You know, his life before this incident. You know, that is quite fascinating.
For me, you know, imagine 10 children. Think about 2 didn't survive to adulthood. The Pile Marsh pit disaster, and there's a fantastic book written about coal mines in Bristol by a lady. Because I never realised how many pits there were in Bristol and the surrounding surrounding area. And then also how horrible a life it was. So for me, it's again, there's Bristol, because people go on about the slave trade. There's so much more to Bristol than meets the eye. And we need to talk about these other things as well. You know, social injustice, the wonderful tunnels under Bristol. I've seen a few.
Oh, excellent. I mean, so, did you say that? I know you were talking to Kate Cherrell. I mean, is there a kind of a time scale? This are we talking like 3 months, 6 months? Do you think for those projects?
I spoke to her today on the phone because she wanted to listen to it, but she was doing a talk herself at a Masonic lodge, and we're hoping to start it if her schedule is free, because we'll need a good month to view all the footage that we've got. I mean, also the amazing interview of Mary Hallowell, because it has to be dedicated to her memory, because this was an amazing woman and it's her story. We're there just to finish it off for her.
There's an interesting thought that's just come to my mind, really. And I was thinking about like CJ Romer's talks for over the last few months. He did a lot of focus, in particular, in regards to true crime and the paranormal. How it's almost like the same fan base, the same audience, kind of comes together, and we sort of celebrate the kind of macabre interest, the kind of the dark arts of the things that kind of tickle the mind. You know, are both prevalent in people who support and like the paranormal, and also those who like true crime. You know, from your perspective there, how do you find those things go together? Because obviously you've spoken at the ASSAP talks and the conferences yourself, and you're here tonight as part of ASSAP. How do you kind of, not necessarily weigh them up? How do you find their audiences are? Are they both malleable to the kind of these kind of stories? Should we say?
So I missed a bit of it because I could hear my husband and son getting a takeaway delivery because they're too lazy to do anything. So I missed you. Just repeat that again.
Yeah, so really kind of, to round that up, I'm saying the audience for the paranormal and the audience for true crime appears to have a kind of a crossover between themselves. You know, those who are quite fascinated with the macabre, the weird, the strange, the unusual, also are those who like the true crime stuff. So how do you find that, you know, you can weigh them up when they are quite different topics, yet their audience is almost the same people? How do you find that?
Yeah, I think that combining the two is one of the greatest things to do. For again, you know, paranormal. What is paranormal? Is it dead people? Are ghosts after for us to tell their story? So at the Jamaica Inn, I want to get the story of the Broad family out there as famous as Daphne du Maurier's connection. So Amelia Dyer, who was a baby farmer who killed lots of the babies, and babies floating up in the River Thames. You know, her story, but also is there an afterlife story to it? how can we contact these people that did these crimes and find out anything more? How would it be of any significance? Who knows?
So, of course, this has actually spurred up a lot of comments in the chat box. There is one of which Chris is saying, "Was there any more strange instances involving the same doctor that you've come across so far?"
No, I haven't. I've read the books, but again, it depends if you're for or against him on the opinion. Kate, being Kate, will find out a lot more, because once she dives her nose into something, nothing can get back. She's amazing like that, and I'm sure we will uncover more things to come.
Absolutely. There's a lot of comments here saying that they can't wait for the documentary. It sounds brilliant. Looking forward to that coming up. Mrs. is a true crime fan here. So if he goes missing, it's most likely going to be her. So I think the best thing to do, perhaps, is Caroline. Is there anything else you wish to add?
Thank you again, Karin, for a wonderful talk. You'll have to give us another date later this year for another further update, I guess.
I think Kate should do that, because
I've already got Kate in for something.
Yeah, she would be brilliant on this, because again, she's also want us to go up and to look at the body snatching, all that trade up in Scotland, because she's friends with the lady of the museum there. So it's going to be exciting, uncovering more things. I can't wait.
Well, thank you for sharing your research with us. It was definitely an interesting story that I want to hear more about when the documentary comes out. But thank you again, Karin. Next week we have Kieran Farrell, and I think, nod if it's correct, are you talking about cold spots? Yes. So next week will be Kieran Farrell. Please come and join us. Kieran, is there anything that you'd like to say?
About cold spots, or just in general?
Just in general.
Just in general. Well, it was a very interesting talk, Karin, and I enjoyed it very much, and particularly the focus on history, because history is one of my sort of favourite sort of pastimes and topics. So it'll be me next week. So there we are, cold spots. Hopefully it won't be too cold to dive into a cold spot or two.
Okay, come and join us next Thursday at 7 o'clock. It will be me. Christian, are you available again next week?
I will be, yes. I'll be here next week.
Perfect. Yeah, it'll be double trouble. And then if Kieran's available, then he'll be here because he's giving the talk. So, perfect. Yeah, so we'll see you all next week. Thank you. Take care, and please stay warm. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Have a good one.
Good night. Thanks.